this first discussion was amazing. I was pinging several of my colleagues in the background saying, "You've got to get on. You've got to look at this. There is more to it than just modeling. There's a larger socioeconomic issue. We heard everything from where do people live to how do people build to how the climate change issues are going to impact our socioeconomic issues. We looked at various maps. We looked at the modeling issues. That was an amazing discussion, and that leads directly into this next conversation around enterprise risk management. Because really what's happening in the enterprise risk management space, for all of you that have been exposed to this, is, all right, we see the data, we see the frequency and severity, we see the issues associated with volatility. Now what? And so the question that Ed was asking when you get to the CFO, now what do you do? This is how you prepare that discussion really upstairs with everybody in that position, along with everybody in society. This is a larger set of issues. So what I'd like to do is start by saying that this discussion is really about an overview of enterprise risk management. Why is it important? How do people think about it? And this is a roundtable discussion. And with me today is Christy Kaufman, who is a distinguished leader with deep expertise in enterprise risk management, InsurTech and compliance ecosystem. Her background includes corporate risk management and insurance leadership roles for Zillow, American Family Insurance, Marsh McLennan, and risk management consulting roles for Ernst & Young and Aon. Christy is a very good colleague of mine, and she is an adjunct professor at the Risk Management Insurance Program at the University of Wisconsin, has lectured several times in that university, and has lectured in my class at the University of Southern California. She's also an associate mentor for early stage risk and insurance ventures through a group called Creative Destructive Labs, and is a director of the global board for the Insurance and Risk Management Society. Christy has been recognized as a risk management all-star by Risk and Insurance magazine, a woman to watch by Business Insurance, an elite woman by Insurance Business America, and a distinguished alumni at the University of Wisconsin. So let me just welcome Christy to this roundtable. Jasmine is a colleague of mine for quite some time. Jasmine, would you introduce yourself to this group?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Klein, and I had the pleasure of meeting Ward when he was my professor at USC. So I graduated from USC in 2020, and I'm currently working for Marsh in our management liability team. But Ward and I continue to work together on fun things like this, and we're really happy to be having this discussion with Christy today.
All right, so what I've tried to do is share my screen. Jasmine, when you see it, let me know.
I see the screen.
Perfect. All right, so Christy, welcome to the discussion, and thank you so much for being with us today. Let's start this discussion on your side as to, all right, so what are we trying to talk about with this group today?
Absolutely. The topic at hand is an overview of enterprise risk management. So my mind works in a very simple way. I sort of went to the 5 W's and the 1 H, who, what, when, why, where, and how. And I think we'll organize the discussion in that fashion. But also I'll be bringing some very practical sort of best practices, lessons learned, war stories, to the table to really help our audience understand how enterprise risk management can be beneficial and work effectively within really any organization in any industry.
So the question here is, so we've talked about this many times before, and there are several different perspectives. From your point of view, what is enterprise risk management?
Yeah, great question. So the definition that I most commonly see referred to is the one that's put out by an organization called COSO, which stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, which is quite a mouthful. And true to their name, the definition that they put out for ERM is also quite a mouthful. So I think it's helpful to break it down into its component parts. And the first aspect that I want everyone to keep in mind is that ERM is a process. It is not a project or an initiative or kind of a one and done. It's something that lives and breathes within an organization throughout time. It is also applied in a strategy setting and across the enterprise. So actually, when I think about defining risk for an organization, the place that I always start is strategy. What is the organization trying to achieve? What are the goals? What are the objectives? And the tactics for how they're going to get there. And that's how I start my conversations with leaders, as I'm trying to understand what risks are. What do you care about? And then risk becomes, what are the potential impediments or even the accelerators that can lead to the achievement of those strategies, either stand in the way of them or help us get there faster. Sort of the uncertainty that exists around each of those strategies. And by aligning risk with strategy in this manner, you're really helping enterprise risk management become relevant to business leaders. It's not something that just exists in the abstract. It's very near and dear to their hearts. And it's also applied across the enterprise. So what I mean by that is this doesn't just exist within a single function or a single division. ERM really is end-to-end within a company. All risks across all categories, including strategic, operational, financial, legal, regulatory, on and on, are in scope as part of this program. And the purpose of the program is to identify potential events that may impact the achievement of strategies. And to identify those risks that could either, as I said, get in the way of achieving those strategies or help accelerate the achievement of those strategies, but ultimately to manage those risks to be within the organization's risk appetite. And I know we're going to talk a bit more word about what risk appetite actually means, but to just sort of put that into layman terms for our audience today, just think of it as within our comfort zone, within the amount of risk that we want to be taking as an organization.
Yeah, so Christy, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, no, go ahead,
going off of that, Christy, you've been talking about aligning risk with strategy. So how do you define risk appetite and how can we make it useful?
Great question, especially the latter half of that. I've seen a lot of examples, unfortunately, of it not being terribly useful. So so let's dive into that. One of the examples that I think really helps bring this concept home for people who are new to this profession or new to the concept of risk management is the concept of a gas gauge, which is really sort of the OG of risk dashboards. I'm sure there are many people on this call who are familiar with this image. They're the type of person that waits until the gas gauge gets all the way on empty and maybe the indicator light comes on before they decide to refill the tank. There are also people on this call more like me who are a little more cautious and tend to pull over right around a quarter tank. And that's just an example of the different levels of risk appetite that we all bring to something as simple as the risk of running out of gas. We can extrapolate this concept to business as well. Businesses face a multitude of risks, including climate, which we just discussed. And the goal of a chief risk officer or an enterprise risk manager is to really define what is the institution's appetite for risk, not the individual employees, because as we know, there's going to be variability there. And it may not always line up with how much risk the company really wants to take. So the goal of people like myself in my role of leading enterprise risk management is to identify where are the key risks where we need to put these specific guardrails in place, where we need to bring this, gas gauge or dashboard to the fore so that we can help our employees really understand, okay, how much risk do they want me to take? And at what point do they want me to escalate or maybe take additional actions to manage this risk in a different way? So in order to make this useful, there are 4 things that I would encourage people to keep in mind. The first is that risk appetite needs to exist not in isolation, but rather relative to reward. This is especially true for some of the more strategic risks that companies face. And so what I mean by this is, if you think about the risk of introducing a new product, we might be willing to take a lot of risk with introducing that product if we stand to gain a lot of revenue, if we think that's going to be a real market winner. But if the economic potential is more moderate, then maybe our risk appetite needs to scale to a more moderate risk appetite as well. So risk appetites can sometimes be more of a sliding scale, depending upon how much reward or gain we stand to achieve by taking the risk.
Christy, when you were at Zillow, there were lots of discussions around risk appetite by individual business activity. But in the large, I mean, from a larger economic standpoint, how did you calculate what the enterprise risk appetite was? Was it measured by specific risks, or was it measured in terms of an economic value? Was it tied to your materiality threshold from an accounting standpoint? How did your CFO and your CEO look at this over a period of time?
That is a great question, and an area that I'll be, perfectly honest with you is an area in which I struggled, because I tried to do all of the things that you mentioned. I tried to tie to our definition of materiality, and I ran some models, looking at what our overall risk-bearing capacity, how much loss can we stand to absorb across any category of risk without having a meaningful impact, for example, on our stock price. I created a bunch of different examples, and I went to senior financial leaders to have these conversations. And really, there wasn't a big appetite for nailing this down, especially at a company that is as innovative and in a constant state of flux as Zillow, and and other tech disruptors, I would say. They were, I think there was part of the question was sort of like, what's the value in coming up with this overall number? And that comes back to this idea that I have included on the slide of like, how can we make it useful? I don't think they thought having one big number was terribly useful. Where it tends to get more useful is when we can break it down to specific risks and specific decisions that our employees are going to encounter on a daily basis, so they know where the guardrails are in terms of where they operate, as opposed to at that overall macro level. Though I certainly have seen companies, especially when I was in consulting, take that step of defining the risk overall. And the most common expression I tended to see was sort of some sort of level of earnings per share that they were willing to withstand some sort of drop in that measure. But again, I personally didn't find it all that practical at that overall level. I'd be curious what you think about that, Ward.
No, I think from an economic standpoint, it's something to bear in mind. But I also wanted to ask, how did risk appetite tie into your risk financing and your insurance programs? Was it part of the discussion with your brokers and with your markets in terms of what you were prepared to take from a retention standpoint? At what price were you prepared to take that? And how did it impact policy limits?
Yeah, it did factor in. That's a great example of when you go to apply it, you want to apply it to a decision that you're actually facing. And that's a perfect example of where this can be very valuable in the decisions that you make around risk retention, and also what size of limits to buy. And so, yes, we did have conversations around, ideal target retention levels, but we also looked at that relative to the trade-off we were getting from the markets. And in some cases, we might have been willing to retain a very high level, but the cost of the insurance was attractive enough that we decided it was a better use of capital to buy down that retention, just because they were willing to make it available so cost effectively. But we did always start from a place of how much risk do we think we can afford to absorb. And also, what is the most efficient use of our capital in buying insurance overall across the portfolio? And where can we get the biggest bang for our bucks? Is it at that higher limit level, taking a higher retention, but buying more limits? Or if we're pretty confident that our exposure level is capped at a certain level, then maybe we focus on buying down that retention if we have, additional capital that we are willing to devote to the cost of insurance.
Yeah, so risk appetite is really important, but also the question is why do companies need ERM? What parts, is there a different need in different parts of the company, or is this a shareholder issue, or is this an investor, more in the investor space? Why do companies do this?
Yeah, great lead into the next slide, actually. Jasmine, I think maybe you're advancing or maybe Ward is. There are a number of different reasons that companies are going after ERM, if you will, today. In fact, I was just reading a study. Gartner estimates that about 31% of companies have ERM programs in place, which is still only a third. Disappointing that to people like me who are passionate about this space, but much larger than when I started in this field about 20 years ago, and that number was closer to 0%. So it's definitely growing. And I would say the reasons that are growing is because of a number of different things. One is our risk profiles are increasing. I mean, we just heard from these extraordinary experts in the field of climate about how that trend line and those bar charts where the bars are getting bigger and bigger as climate risk becomes more and more of an issue that we need to contend with. Additional risks, political conflicts across the globe that we're seeing, risks around volatility of interest rates and macroeconomic, risks around the introduction of AI to companies and what that means for not only the company and its staffing, but society at large, cyber, on and on. We seem to be contending with more and more major issues on a daily basis. And companies are realizing that it behooves them to put a systematic program in place for how to address these things so that we're not always on the back foot reacting to the issue of the day, but we've given some thought to anticipating what these risks might be. We've got some plans in place if they were to happen for how we would address them, or either try to prevent them from happening, or at least minimize the impact if they do occur. So that's one big reason, is that ERM adds a lot of value. The second is that companies are realizing that they really owe it to their customers, to their partners, and to their investors to do all that they can to try to minimize unwanted surprises and reduce uncertainty. So again, there's this benefit of having a more systematic kind of program in place to address these issues. And then last but not least, for many, it is not optional. So the regulatory community is also increasingly interested in ERM. I'm the one who asked the question in the last session about the SEC climate disclosure rules, which I believe are still in draft form, but are expected to come out later this month. Those rules will require companies to disclose their climate risks, especially around the transition risks they expect to face, what the impacts of those risks might be, and what the governance is around how companies are going to respond to those risks. Similarly, we've got risks that came out earlier this year, maybe it was late last year, in the cyber domain, where companies are now required to disclose cyber incidents as soon as they've discovered that they had a material impact on the organization. They also have to disclose what is the governance process around how cyber incidents are managed. And then more broadly, public companies also have to produce risk disclosures in their 10Ks, and they have to disclose the role of their board in overseeing risk management in general. So there's a lot of regulation in place for public companies. There's also a lot of industry-specific regulation that primarily impacts industries like banking, insurance, and energy, heavily regulated industries, where they are all but required to have enterprise risk management programs in place as well. Banks in particular, large banks, are required to set aside capital and demonstrate that they've set aside sufficient capital to fund for their most significant risks should they occur. And then there are also the quasi-regulatory organizations like the rating agencies. S&P and Moody's are starting to ask more and more questions around how companies manage risk, and lenders as well. So if you if you are borrowing from any of the major banks, one of their first and foremost questions is, do you have an ERM program in place, and tell me about it. So lots of drivers for why these programs exist today.
As a follow-up question, in the event that somebody doesn't have the semblance of or a robust enterprise risk management methodology, and let's say you're a publicly traded company, are there penalties for this?
I'm not aware of any direct penalties. Maybe you are, or maybe there's been something more recent that's come out, but it's more indirect. If you don't have a robust risk disclosure, and if you aren't having much to say about the role of your board in the role that it plays in enterprise risk management, that's going to come through to potential investors. With S&P and Moody's, their ratings impact your cost of capital when they assign that credit rating. If you don't have a good story to tell around ERM, particularly if you're in the financial services or energy sector, that can impact your credit rating, and then up goes your cost of borrowing.
Right. Terrific. Now, I'm not sure, because I can't see which slide is actually on the screen. Are you seeing who does, why do companies need ERM? Okay,
yeah.
So
yeah,
what you should,
that's the one.
All right, so I'm gonna take you to the next slide.
Sounds good. Jasmine, did you have a question? I thought I heard you stepping in.
Yeah. One more question on that last slide. I was just curious, how have you seen companies' need for ERM change over the course of your career? I know with the rise of social media and more recent disruptions like COVID-19, cyber, etc. Do you feel like there's now a closer eye on ERM?
I do. Definitely. And there are statistics out there to support that as well. Unfortunately, I'm unable to quote any of them at the moment. But when I started in this space, it was pretty much only, I would say, the banks and maybe the utility companies that had what they called quote unquote ERM programs in place, but they were really more narrowly focused on the financial risk. So in banking, it's credit market liquidity. And in energy, it's, commodity volatility. And there were experts in those spaces. What's happened since then is those industries have gotten much more robust in their approach, and they're looking at risk more broadly. So they are thinking about risks like reputation risk, and you mentioned, the advent of social media and sort of the negativity that can exist through that domain. And then I've also seen companies outside those regulated spaces, such as tech companies, voluntarily elect into ERM. So they may not have a specific regulation in their industry that says you must have this, but they've got all these other factors that I just talked about, where they've got customers asking questions, they've got partners, investors asking questions, they're concerned about their credit rating agency. And so, a lot of those non-regulated entities are also opting in, which is great to see, both for corporate performance and for our profession as well.
Are you, as a follow-up too, are you seeing that these various risk domains, hazard, operational, market, reputational, human capital, for example, are these remaining relatively separate from each other, or are you seeing the movement towards a more portfolio view?
Definitely a move towards a more portfolio view. And I think that's partly just a practical thing that has to happen, because so many of these risks are hard to categorize. What starts as a financial risk in one area, quickly transitions to a reputation risk if it hits social media or the press. These risks bleed into one another very quickly. And so I think what we've found is that categorizing risk is useful in terms of just making sure that we're being exhaustive in thinking of all the different, sources of risk to an organization. But then where we quickly need to evolve to is thinking more about that sort of that domino effect as we're doing our analysis, to understand what the true overall impact of a risk might be as it impacts us, not only from financial perspective, but maybe a legal, regulatory, and also a reputation, and all the different ways that risk can affect us.
The other side of it too is that when you're looking at risk prevention or mitigation, particularly on the mitigation side, most of our solutions are risk specific and not portfolio.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do we develop utilizing these tools and utilizing the math that we can actually perform? Again, going back to the climate change issue, if you have a climate change issue that impacts the growing of tomatoes. How does somebody who makes ketchup deal with that issue? So it's a climate
Yeah.
change issue, but it's also a supply chain issue.
Ecosystem risk. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
where do you put your next plant, or where do you drive distribution? It's a very, very integrated kind of exercise, but we don't treat it that way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I would love to be able to treat it that way. So Ward and Jasmine, you can go back to Aon and Marsh and figure that out and bring some products to bear. I remember like 20 years ago, we started to see some integrated insurance portfolios that maybe brought in a couple of risks. I'm forgetting the name. United Grain Growers, I think, did sort of, and Honeywell, I think, had these sort of they were first out to buy these basket insurance programs that insured maybe the liability with the property and one other thing. I think Grain Growers had a commodity risk in there, but it didn't really take off, and I'm not sure exactly why that is. Maybe because it's really difficult. It's really hard to quantify the impacts of all these risks. As just our prior climate disclosure, part of the discussion was around the lack of data for risks like wildfire, which are growing, right? Well, we can't just look to history to tell us how big this risk is going to be in the future. And so I think that's part of the challenge is, what do you do? How do you quantify this and understand what this risk really is when you don't have the data to tell you? And you have to make some of those sort of, more qualitative leaps, I think, in order to get there. But, I definitely have heavy appetite for treating these risks in a more basket-driven, portfolio-driven approach to the extent that the market can take us there.
Right. Good. All right. So I'm going to move forward and tell me, which slide are you actually seeing now?
The one about who does what within an ERM program within a company.
Very good.
So so let's talk about this. So it all starts at the very top of the house with the board of directors. I mentioned before that the SEC says that, at least for publicly traded companies, but really this is true for all companies, that the board has the ultimate responsibility for risk oversight. It's not uncommon for the board, though, to delegate that responsibility to one of its subcommittees, because the board always has a very full agenda, and to give risk its due attention, it sometimes makes sense to assign it to either the audit committee or a separate risk committee of the board. And I've worked in both of these scenarios. I've worked with a company that voluntarily elected to set up its own risk committee of the board, which is not that common, but great to see whenever it happens. I've also worked for a company where the risk oversight was assigned to the audit committee. And then, those subcommittees summarize the conversation that's had there and serve that up to the full board so they have visibility. So in order to help the board and or its subcommittees fulfill this responsibility, there's often an executive level or management level risk committee that exists within a company as well. And this is usually a cross-functional group that consists of senior leaders across the various functions, so HR, IT, legal, etc., as well as some of the business leaders. And sometimes it's organized on a rotating basis. Sometimes it's the same group of individuals, but a very senior group that acts as a steering function to really make sure that the enterprise risk management program is focused on the right risks, is adequately resourced, and the information that's being served up to the board is well understood by senior leaders, and they are prepared to take all necessary steps to address their risks. Then below that, you may or may not see some type of risk working group that's maybe a couple levels down or a level down from the executive risk committee, that's comprised of more of the doers. So maybe for each of these functions or businesses, there's someone who is kind of the eyes and ears of risk management for that team. And they do things like help spot risks that are coming up through their area and notifying the executive risk committee and the enterprise risk management team of those risks, gathering data on those risks. So if risk indicators have been developed for key risks, they are the ones collecting that data, monitoring it, and really helping with development of action plans, that those need to be put in place to address the risks, and sort of serving as mini part-time risk managers within each of their teams. And then you might also see some specialty risk committees. So at many of the companies that I work for example, we'll have an information security risk committee. And that's because that risk is so technical and so in-depth and requires so much involvement, so much activity that it deserves its own forum and is separated out. And then, like, for example, I also led a health and safety committee at the height of COVID. You know, some of these risks committees will form as issues come along, and then, you know, maybe they get sunsetted as issues dissipate. And then the role of me as an enterprise risk manager and my team is really to keep this whole process and framework moving. So we train each of these groups on what their responsibilities are. We advise them. We very carefully and respectfully challenge them from time to time if we think that, for example, they are not prioritizing a risk effectively, if it deserves more weight or it deserves more resourcing. We also maintain a centralized repository of all the risk information that's coming in. So the minutes from all these committee meetings, as well as the risk indicators, the dashboards that we produce. We use technology at Zillow. We were using Origami. At American Family, we use Logic Manager. There are a number of different tools that are out there to sort of eliminate a lot of the manual data collection that can become a real headache for an ERM department. And then we also synthesize and communicate the risk insights across this entire structure for senior leadership and the board, so that they get sort of the overall picture of how we're performing on risk every given quarter.
I have a couple of follow-up questions, one actually from the group. And that the one from the group was, does or would Zillow consider giving risk management information to realtors and property owners?
Very interesting. I think it would depend on what it is. Zillow is a very transparent company in general, and one of the core values of the company is turn the lights on. And so we turn the lights on as much as we can. So it would really depend on what's being asked of us. Where we may be a little more guarded, gosh, it's hard to think of where we might be. Maybe things around like cybersecurity risk, because there's obviously information you don't want to get out in that domain, because you don't want hackers to have sort of the footprint for how to hack your system. So there's some things that we're pretty careful about there. But in general, we're a pretty open company.
The second question is really along the lines of how does this process internal to the organization, starting with the board, your audit committee, your executive committees, et cetera, what happens if they disagree? What happens if they disagree around the risks themselves, the domains that they're in, and the potential solutions that are out there? How do you solve conflict?
That's a good question. And let me tell you, they do. They definitely do. One of the exercises that I love to run with a senior leadership team is a workshop where we, pull up our list of key risks, and we go through each of them and we rate individually, maybe using like voting technology, how likely we think each risk is to occur and what the impact might be if the risk did occur. And, kind of require people to do that individually and then broadcast the results on a screen. 99 times out of 100, it's going to showcase that there's a lot of variability in terms of how people think about those things. And the best thing that you can do is just get that out there and start having that discussion in a group forum. So using a workshop like the one I just described is a great way to do it, because you can say, okay, somebody in this room rated this risk a 10, somebody else rated it a 2. Obviously, we've got some disagreement here. Can I hear from each of you on your perspective? And then we can try to get to consensus after we hear from the various points of view around that risk. But I'll also say, this risk is laid out hierarchical for a reason, because this is a hierarchical program, and the buck really stops with the board of directors. So if there's a true disagreement or a different perspective, it really comes down to, what does the board think? And if the board thinks that a risk is, maybe a bigger risk than management does, for example, then we obviously have to give that risk priority. And then, it trickles down from there. Senior leadership obviously has a larger voice than middle management, and so on and so forth. But it is important to hear all the voices, because sometimes the biggest insights that you have come from those closest to the risk, the front line, people who are seeing things day to day that maybe senior leaders don't see. So, I try to be cognizant of representing all levels of opinion when steering these conversations.
I mean, very clearly there's a distribution. When you get into these sorts of workshops, you clearly get to see the distribution of views. One of the things that those of us that are on the quantitative side are really interested in is, all right, how were the definitions of risk as we talked about them? How were they consistent or inconsistent? All of us have put together risk maps. All of us have done heat maps. All of us have done this sort of risk ranking exercises.
Yeah.
For you and the way you look at this process, how do you distinguish between something that's a true material risk to the enterprise and something that's anecdotal? What are the criteria that you use to put a risk on a map as opposed to not putting it on the map?
Yeah, that's another great question, of course, from you, Ward. You never let me off easy, or the students in your class. The more objective criteria we can bring to this process, the better. So, in the interest of time today, I didn't really get into the weeds of like the rating scales that I use to address risk, but I'm happy to provide those to anyone who wants to follow up with me afterwards. But as an example, when we are prioritizing risk as sort of a step one in the process to understand where we want to focus our efforts, we look at things like likelihood and impact. And for impact, I have, a number of different scales that I ask people to rate the risk against. One is a financial impact. So that's a dollar value unbudgeted loss that we think this risk could lead to. Even though we may not have that historical data, like the climate example we just heard, we do at least try. It does drive some sort of standardization to force people to think about at least this common criteria of unbudgeted loss. I have a risk reputation framework that I use as well, like with maybe the high end of the scale being like being on the front page of the Wall Street Journal every day for a week for a really bad thing that just happened. Do we think this risk could lead to that? Or is this risk on the low end where like maybe this only hits the local news? And so we have a legal rating scale that we use as well, a compliance scale. And so for every risk that we come up with, we do ask people to rate them against all of those scales. We average those. We have these discussions where we where there's inconsistency, try to align. And same on the likelihood scale as well. Like, what is the percentage likelihood of this type of event happening? Just, try to be as objective as we possibly can. And if we do have the benefit of data, then great, all the better, right? We don't have to rely on opinion. We can look at models to tell us how large this risk might be. That's easier for risks where there's some sort of historical pattern than it is for some of the more strategic risks, like competition, as an example.
Hopefully I've advanced this slide appropriately.
You did.
All right.
All right. So I think that's a good transition into how do we monitor risks, Christy?
Yeah. So, Ward, you mentioned heat maps. A lot of people have something against heat maps. I don't really have anything against heat maps. I mean, they're they serve their purpose in this world. Like they give us a sense of priority. But as long as we're not relying too much on them to give us real valuable risk insights, they're really just the tipping off point and the starting point. And what I think is a much more valuable visualization of risk information is the example that you see here. This is an example I've extracted for one risk on my risk dashboard. Picture my risk dashboard being like 20 some odd of these boxes, a box for each risk. And what this box is meant to show is that we have a key risk. Let's assume this risk is the risk of cyber liability. And the key risk indicator that we've established is the incident rate, the rate of cyber incidents relative to some number of transactions, or however you would define that in your environment. Step one was first of all, identifying cyber as a key risk. We just talked about how we did that by trying to rate the risk, likelihood, and impact. We've gotten to the point where we decided it is a material risk and what we want to drive deeper on. The next step is to work with the risk owners in the business or the functions who are working with this risk on a daily basis. The CISO, for example, if we continue with our example of cyber liability, and work with them to understand what are some leading indicators that could tell us if we're going to have a problem with this risk, if things are getting outside of our comfort zone. So in order to do that, we also have to define our comfort zone. So back to this concept of risk tolerance or risk appetite, we want to predefine, if we just establish that incident rate is the metric, where's the red, yellow, green around that metric? Where, at what level do we get really uncomfortable that something could be really wrong? That's the red. Yellow is like, ooh, we're not completely panicked yet, but we should be keeping a closer eye on this. And green is like, all is well. So what you're looking at here is an example of a trend line of the cyber incident rate. And this is a hypothetical example, but let's assume a cyber incident rate juxtaposed against the risk tolerance levels that have been previously established. And what we see in this example is that the risk started off in the yellow zone where we needed to monitor it more closely. It went straight up into the red zone where we got very uncomfortable and exceeded our risk tolerance. We then came back down into the yellow and eventually into the green. And what is useful about this type of graphic, not only in terms of conveying a rather complicated message in a simplistic form, is that it makes the concept of risk appetite actionable. So the process that we've also put in place around this type of deliverable is that anytime that a risk gets into the red, we say that the risk owner or the risk champion or whoever is assigned to, really spearhead that particular risk. Again, let's assume it's the CISO for information security risk. That individual has to come up with a plan for how the risk is going to come out of the red and be brought back into at least the yellow and hopefully into the green. And we continue along that course for as long as the risk is in the red. Every quarter when we meet with the board, if we're in the red, we still have to talk about what we're doing to try to bring the risk down. And so that's a really effective way, an objective way, because again, we're looking at indicators and metrics as opposed to opinion, for establishing a good program around when and how to intervene to better manage risks.
I mean, in the few minutes that we have left, what I'd like to do is get you to that next slide around how do you measure its effectiveness? How do you actually get from red to yellow to green? And how do you hold it in the green? What do you actually do?
So I included this question around how do we measure program effectiveness because it's one that I often get that always makes me squirm. And I hope people, maybe people in the audience have ideas as well. If so, please, comment in the chat or follow up with me afterwards. But, it's sort of easier said than done, like much of this work, because quantifying the return on an ERM program is like proving a negative. Like, what is the value of a loss avoided? Well, how do we know if we avoided the loss, what size it would have been? So you can kind of get caught chasing your tail. And so where I have tended to focus is a little bit more around tangentially to the program. So when I'm just getting started with an ERM program, I start by just trying to baseline current risk levels, coming up with those indicators, like the one that I just showed around the cyber incident rate. Like, how are we going to measure this risk? And where are we today? So we at least know if we're getting better or worse over time. Sometimes we have the luxury of that for certain risks. Other times we have to build it if it's a new risk that's coming onto our radar. As we move into a more mature program and we're thinking about implementing and optimizing, we can start to look at things like actual risk level relative to target. So as we establish those tolerances, we can say, well, how many of these risks are in the red? We can aggregate that across our entire portfolio to see, as an overall program, are we getting better or worse at managing risk? I also look at customer satisfaction metrics. So I survey my business partners. These are internal business partners, my risk owners, the people on my risk working group, the members of my senior level risk committee, to say, how do you think we're doing? And part of that is also, how burdensome are we? We're asking a lot of people to do things kind of outside of their day job as part of this work, to gather risk data, to develop action plans. We want to be as light on the sort of the bureaucratic aspects of the program as we possibly can be, and really be focused on the value-added impact. So I ask a lot of questions in that vein. And then, once we get more mature, we can look at things like total cost of risk, which includes our retained losses, plus the cost of risk transfer, which includes insurance and expenses. Also measuring things like near misses can also be a good read. If you are able to drive your incidents down, then you can start looking even deeper at, like, well, where did we get close to having an incident? And aggregate those against different risk categories as well.
Yeah, my impression is that most of this is pretty applicable in the hazard risk space, right? Where you've got insurable versus non-insurable or self-insurable kinds of risks, where you have, let's say it's workers' compensation, general liability, property, et cetera. You have some data that sits there. But when you start moving into reputation, or you start moving into the human capital space, it gets, as you say, a little squishy and a little bit harder to work with.
It does. I mean, we look at things like human capital, we look at like voluntary turnover of high performers. We do look at like media incident rates in the sort of the social reputation space. But to your point, it took a long time to be able to get there and baseline those, and we're continually working on it as well, continuing to iterate.
Well, I'm going to have Jasmine with the final wrap up, but my wrap up is, Christy, thank you so much for being part of this discussion. We're kind of at time. Jasmine, you have the final word.
Sure. I actually think we have a couple more minutes if there are any last questions in the chat, but echoing Ward's words, thank you so much, Christy. I definitely learned a lot and know that everyone.
It's great to be here. I want you all to know I'm a Californian at heart. Even though I live in the Midwest, my son goes to USC. So he's not in the business school though, Ward. I'm working on him to get him over into your class. But I love to visit LA, and I'm out there a lot, and have great respect for my CPCU brethren out your way.
Well, I mean, are there any other questions from the audience around enterprise risk management, how you think about this problem? I think there were a couple of questions that came up. Is the risk management role in the ERM context viewed as great to have or a reluctant to have?
Both. I think with any role, you're going to have your cheerleaders and you're going to have your detractors. I don't think ERM is any different in that regard. Hopefully you can tip the needle towards more cheerleaders over time. I really focus on developing sort of those quick wins and those where I can really add value to a business leader. Again, I said at the very beginning, I like to understand their strategy, what they're trying to achieve. If I can link risk to that and help them achieve their objectives, help them get their bonus, quite frankly, word starts to travel, and then more and more people are welcoming, risk into the conversation. But it takes time. It takes time, definitely.
I mean, something that we didn't talk about in this discussion, which is showing up both academically and in the real world, is the development of the chief risk officer, where the chief risk officer has risk mitigation, enterprise risk management, maybe risk finance skills, maybe also operational. And the trajectory of this particular discipline appears to be the same as the development of the chief financial officer. So if you go back to the 1950s, there weren't CFOs. There were lots and lots of treasurers because capital was abundant. The penalties for not managing it correctly weren't particularly high, and the skill sets associated with the treasury function were pretty straightforward and were dominantly dominated by the accounting function. Well, as capital became scarce or the capital allocation became more difficult, you started seeing new tools and capabilities come to the table, and you started seeing business schools develop and the development of the MBA. Same thing's happening here for all of you in the CPCU space. The tools are different, the tools are more dynamic, there's more portfolio orientation to all of this. So there is this parallel trajectory between what we saw in the development of the CFO and now the development of the CRO. And many large organizations are adopting this methodology, and this individual is reporting directly into the board. So this individual is living with the C-suite and involved intrinsically in the development of strategy. So there's a lot that's sitting there. So another question say, I think rating the importance of various risks in an organization is a great strategy. Also, I agree that it's important to hear all stakeholders in the rating process, and that came in from Dwight. Any other questions from the audience? All right, so with that, I'm going to apologize for my dog's breakfast in managing slides. And so I think we're going to take just a couple of minute break between this session and the next session, which focuses on the issue of cyber. So with that, thank you very much, everybody.
Awesome.
We'll look forward to seeing you in a couple, 3 minutes.